What happens when a conservative firebrand walks into a liberal stronghold with no intention of playing nice? What happens when the mask of civility slips and live television becomes a war zone? The atmosphere on set was calm, but it was the kind of calm that doesn't last. The bright lights of The View cast their usual flattering glow on the sleek glass table, while the audience settled into their seats with paper-thin smiles and lukewarm applause. Whoopi Goldberg, positioned at the center, exuded quiet authority, her tone measured and her expression unreadable. Seated to her right was the morning's guest, Charlie Kirk, conservative commentator, campus agitator, known provocateur. The audience wasn't sure what to expect, but the producers behind the curtain had an idea. They weren't just expecting sparks, they were counting on them. Kirk leaned forward in his chair, adjusting the mic clipped to his lapel as if it were a weapon. He shook hands with Whoopi, brief, firm, performative, and offered a sanitized grin to the co-hosts lined up beside her. They returned it, some more genuinely than others. The segment kicked off with familiar notes. Talk of civic engagement, youth voting, and coming together. It was the kind of public relations fluff that normally fills the first few minutes of airtime. But from the way Whoopi subtly squared her shoulders and the way Charlie kept glancing at his notes like they were ammunition, the facade wouldn't last long. The audience, sensing something beneath the surface, clapped politely. The first question landed. It was civil. So was the first answer. But civility wasn't the point of this segment. Conflict was. Behind the camera, a producer whispered into the control mic, "Let it run. Don't interrupt unless it gets ugly." Another assistant hovered near the teleprompter, ready to cut away. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. Because when Charlie Kirk entered that studio, he didn't just come to talk. He came to draw lines. And the moment Whoopi Goldberg pushed back, the quiet tension cracked, live, raw, and irreversible. The applause faded just seconds before the first real shot was fired. It came not as a raised voice or a direct insult, but as a carefully phrased challenge, sharp enough to sting, soft enough to disguise as curiosity. "Charlie," Whoopi began, her eyes narrowing just slightly, "you talk a lot about traditional values, but whose traditions are we talking about?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Kirk's smile tightened. He'd been waiting for this. "The kind that built the country," he replied, voice crisp, measured. "Faith, family, freedom." It was the kind of answer that looked good clipped for social media, but Whoopi didn't flinch. That's when the exchange started to tilt. "And where do people like me fit into that picture?" she asked. Her tone was calm, but there was fire beneath it. "Because when I hear traditional, I don't always hear inclusion." Kirk leaned forward. "We can't rewrite history just to protect feelings," he said. "America isn't perfect, but it's better than the alternatives people keep pushing." The audience murmured, some in support, others in disbelief. The co-hosts shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Whoopi and Kirk like they were watching a fuse burn toward the powder keg. This wasn't debate. This was confrontation masquerading as conversation. In the control room, tension mounted. A segment producer whispered, "Give them 30 more seconds, then we pivot." But the hosts weren't pivoting, and neither was Kirk. "You're here talking about protecting the country," Whoopi said slowly, "but what exactly are you protecting it from?" Kirk didn't miss a beat. "From being dismantled by radical ideologies," he said, "from moral decay, from institutions that have forgotten what this country stands for." The words weren't just meant for the table, they were aimed at the cameras, at the audience at home, at every headline that would follow. The segment was barely 5 minutes in, but the gloves had already come off, and there was no producer in the building who could put them back on. By the time the second block began, the tension had evolved from subtle friction to an undercurrent of defiance. The audience was no longer clapping on cue, they were reacting in real time. Some leaned forward with interest, others shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. The scripted cards still sat neatly in front of the co-hosts, but no one was following the plan anymore. The studio had become something else entirely. A courtroom without a judge, a stage without a script. And at the center of it sat Whoopi and Charlie, locked in ideological combat with every word. Kirk seized the next opportunity. "There's a reason people are tuning out of mainstream media," he said, his tone a mix of righteousness and control. "They're tired of being lectured by elites who look down on their values." He glanced directly at Whoopi as he spoke, a pointed gesture meant to trigger. Whoopi raised her eyebrows, her face steady, but her posture now tighter. "That's funny," she said, her voice dry, "because I hear the same complaint about your show." Laughter broke out from a section of the audience, half relieved, half nervous. Kirk chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Touché," he said flatly, but his tone betrayed the calculation behind every syllable. One of the co-hosts attempted to diffuse the tension with a lighthearted segue, but the air was too heavy. Even the band offstage and half forgotten remained silent. In the control booth, the lead producer gave a quick signal to stand by a filler graphic, just in case. "We're here for a real conversation," Whoopi said, reclaiming the moment. "But you can't pretend to have a dialogue when you come armed for a monologue." Kirk leaned back as if welcoming the fire. "I didn't come here to be liked," he said. "I came here to tell the truth." It wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration of war. And the smiles on set, once camera-ready and controlled, had begun to disappear completely. It came wrapped in the calm professionalism of daytime TV, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. "Charlie," Whoopi said, folding her hands as she spoke, "you've criticized public education, LGBTQ rights, and immigration policy, all in the name of preserving American values. What do you say to the millions of Americans who feel like those values exclude them?" Her voice never rose. She didn't need it to. The weight was in the silence that followed. Kirk took a breath, sat forward, and delivered his reply with surgical precision. "I say, inclusion shouldn't mean erasing everything that made this country strong." The studio stilled. Audience members who had laughed minutes ago now exchanged glances. A few murmurs rose, quickly hushed by stage managers. Kirk wasn't backing down. "We've gone from fighting for civil rights to fighting over pronouns," he continued. "We're more offended by jokes than we are by failing schools or broken families." He was stacking his argument like bricks, building a rhetorical wall that was meant to corner the hosts. But Whoopi didn't move. "So whose rights matter?" she asked, her voice cool. "Whose America are you defending when the people living in it can't recognize themselves in your version of it?" She wasn't asking for clarification, she was daring him to say it out loud. Backstage, a junior producer stepped closer to the control board. "Should we pull the buffer feed?" she asked. "Not yet," came the reply. "They're still within limits." But that limit was shrinking fast. Kirk glanced at the camera, then back to Whoopi. "I'm defending the people who still believe this country is worth preserving," he said, measured and firm. "Not tearing down and rebuilding into something it was never meant to be." The line hit the studio like a slap. You could feel the audience stiffen, feel the air constrict. Whoopi leaned in, eyes narrowed, shoulders forward. The tone had shifted again, this time into something far more combustible. Kirk didn't wait for the next question. He launched into his own offensive, abandoning the pretense of polite exchange. "You know what's fascinating?" he began, his voice rising just slightly. "Shows like this preach tolerance and open-mindedness, but the moment someone like me walks in and offers a different view, I'm treated like a threat." The room bristled. Audience members began murmuring again, louder this time. Whoopi didn't flinch. She'd heard this kind of framing before, an attempt to weaponize victimhood as a shield for confrontation. But Kirk wasn't finished. "I'm not here to be your villain," he said, "but I won't be your punching bag either." Whoopi leaned back slowly in her chair. Her eyes locked onto his. "You're not a villain, Charlie," she said carefully. "But you walk in here pushing a worldview that erases people's lives, and then you call it truth. That's not courage. That's arrogance." The audience erupted, some with applause, others with audible gasps. One or two clapped and then stopped, unsure which side to take. Kirk cracked a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, "but facts don't care about your feelings." It was a rehearsed line, one he'd used in speeches and sound bites. But in this room, at this table, it landed like a provocation. Not a rebuttal, an attack. The temperature in the room spiked. Even the co-hosts, who'd mostly stayed quiet during the volley, began shifting uncomfortably. One of them interjected, "Can we maybe bring this back to policy instead of platitudes?" But the damage had already been done. Kirk had drawn his line and Whoopi had crossed hers. The discussion wasn't about topics anymore. It was about territory, about who owned the room. And for the first time, it became clear that neither one of them was going to give it up. Not quietly, not politely, not today. The tension that had been simmering finally snapped. Whoopi leaned in, her voice calm but unmistakably sharp. "Charlie, you keep talking about free speech, but what you're really defending is your right to say things without consequence. That's not how the world works. Not anymore." The audience let out a collective murmur. She wasn't raising her voice, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. There was steel behind her words now, and Kirk heard it. He adjusted in his seat, straightening like he was preparing for impact. "I'm not afraid of consequences," Kirk replied, meeting her gaze. "I'm afraid of a culture that punishes dissent. There's a difference." Whoopi didn't blink. "And there's a difference between dissent and disrespect," she fired back. "You don't get to hide behind honesty when the message dehumanizes people." The co-hosts sat in silence, watching the two lock horns. The air inside the studio felt heavier, the audience no longer laughing, no longer reacting with scripted enthusiasm. They were watching something real, something unscripted, something that felt like it might go off the rails at any moment. A producer backstage muttered under her breath, "We need to break to commercial." But no one gave the signal. Ratings, tension, and spectacle were taking precedence over protocol. Kirk's voice lowered, but his words carried more weight now. "I came here expecting to be challenged, not demonized," he said. "If this show wants an honest conversation, let's have one. But don't pretend that disagreement equals hate." Whoopi held her ground, still calm but clearly done entertaining talking points. "You came here to provoke," she said. "And you got what you wanted." The moment hung there, electric, unresolved. And the only certainty was that they were far from finished. The crowd had started the show with enthusiasm, clapping on cue, chuckling politely, nodding through the early exchanges. But by now, the energy had curdled into something tense and unpredictable. Some audience members leaned forward, eyes wide, tracking every word like spectators at a prize fight. Others sat stiffly, their arms crossed, visibly uncomfortable. One woman near the front row whispered to her friend, "This doesn't feel right." It didn't. What began as a scheduled guest segment had shifted into a standoff, and the crowd knew it. When Kirk made another pointed remark about activist teachers indoctrinating children, an audible gasp came from the far right corner of the audience. A man in the back muttered, "Unbelievable," loud enough to be picked up by a stage mic. Whoopi, without missing a beat, turned to the camera and addressed the viewers at home. "This is what happens when someone brings a bullhorn to a conversation," she said. "You don't get discussion. You get disruption." That's when the first chorus of claps returned, but it wasn't unified. It was fractured. Supportive, yes, but shadowed by growing discomfort. Some were cheering for Whoopi, others were simply reacting to the chaos, and the line between applause and alarm was beginning to blur. Backstage, the executive producer leaned into the comms feed. "We ride it a little longer," he said, "but prep the delay switch." One floor manager subtly motioned to security to stand closer to the stage wings, not because anything had happened, but because of what might. On screen, Kirk leaned back, undeterred. "You want to call it disruption," he said, voice calm. "I call it confronting hypocrisy." The moment was drenched in defiance, and in the silence that followed, no one laughed, no one clapped. Because now it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The audience wasn't sure whether to engage or escape, and that uncertainty was spreading across the room like smoke before a fire. In the darkened hallway just behind the studio, the control room lit up with red indicators as producers huddled around a growing crisis. The air was thick with anxiety. Monitors showed every angle, the tight shots on Whoopi's face, the close-ups of Charlie's tightening jaw. The audience now caught somewhere between intrigue and unease. The showrunner stood with one hand on the desk and the other gripping a headset mic. "If we lose the room, we cut to commercial," he said flatly. "No exceptions." but no one wanted to blink first. The segment was explosive, the numbers spiking, and everyone in that control room knew the tension was television gold, until it wasn't. Out on stage, Charlie Kirk went on the offensive again. "This country is suffering because we've confused freedom with fragility," he said, eyes scanning the room. "We used to teach resilience. Now we reward outrage." Whoopi gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And we used to know the difference between a dialogue and a dog whistle," she replied. There was a pause, the kind that slows time. The kind where everyone waits to see what lands first, the words or the fallout. One co-host reached gently for her mug, not to sip, but to fill the space with something normal. It didn't work. The studio was already off script and headed towards something that couldn't be walked back. One of the associate producers whispered to the director, "We've lost control of the tone." He nodded but didn't call the break. Not yet. On the floor, the camera operators remained locked in, holding tight on facial reactions as the energy shifted from uncomfortable to unpredictable. A junior production assistant watched the studio feed with wide eyes, muttering, "This is turning into a live fire drill." And that's exactly what it was. Because once the line between debate and spectacle was crossed, there was no guarantee anyone could steer it back. Not even Whoopi. Not even with cameras rolling. And then it happened. The moment no producer could edit out, no co-host could smooth over. Kirk, emboldened by the rising tension, delivered a line that detonated across the studio. "You talk about oppression like it's still 1964, he said, eyes locked on Whoopi. "But today the most silenced voices in America are conservative Christians and white working-class families." Gasps broke across the audience like a wave. One woman audibly said, "Wow," while another shook her head and reached for her bag. The shift wasn't just audible, it was physical. People began leaning back in their seats, stunned, as if they'd just witnessed something indecent disguised as opinion. Whoopi didn't speak immediately. She stared at Kirk with a stillness that somehow conveyed more fury than any raised voice could. "Do you hear yourself?" she finally said, her voice low and sharp. "You came on this show to play victim while dismissing generations of people who still carry the weight of injustice in their skin." Her words were ice and fire wrapped into one. You want to talk about who's being silenced? Try being a black woman in America who's been told her whole life to sit down and smile while the world rewrites the truth. The room erupted. Half the audience cheered. The other half sat frozen. The battle lines had never been clearer. Backstage, the producer's voice cracked through the headset. "Cut the cameras if it escalates one more level." But it was already too late. The viral moment had arrived. The clip would be online before the broadcast even ended. Whoopi had stood her ground. Kirk had taken his swing. And the audience had stopped being spectators. They were now witnesses to a moment that had snapped the show's thin boundary between conversation and confrontation. And the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were happening, live, unfiltered, and irreversible. The red tally light above camera 3 went dark, signaling a cut to commercial. The audience exhaled all at once, the air thick with aftershock. But backstage, no one was breathing easy. The control room erupted into organized panic. "Get legal on standby," the showrunner snapped. "We might have a PR crisis on our hands." Floor staff scrambled, not toward their usual reset marks, but toward damage control. Coffee was abandoned. Composure forgotten. One assistant stage manager leaned against the wall and whispered, "We should have cut 2 minutes earlier." Everyone knew it, but no one had dared stop what had become a perfect storm. On set, the silence between Whoopi and Charlie Kirk was louder than their argument had been. He stayed seated, flipping through the cards on the table like nothing had happened. Whoopi didn't look at him. She stared out across the audience, her body still as stone. A co-host reached for her hand, grounding her just enough to stop the tremor behind her jaw. One of the producers approached from the wings, voice low. "We can pivot to the book segment," she offered. Whoopi shook her head. "We're not pretending this didn't just happen." Across the stage, Kirk smirked. Not because he had won anything, but because this was exactly the kind of moment he knew would explode online. Backstage, PR reps huddled in a hallway, debating whether to release a statement. Social media monitors already had screenshots. Hashtags were climbing. And they weren't kind. "We can't bury it. One staffer said. "This is going to be the only thing people talk about." The director looked up at the studio feed, watched Whoopi's posture harden, and Kirk's eyes scanned the crowd, calculating. "Forget a reset," he muttered. "We just hit the iceberg. Now we're trying to steer the wreckage." The band played its way back from break, but nothing, absolutely nothing, would be business as usual from this point on. As the cameras resumed, the audience was hushed but restless. What had begun as a provocative exchange was now hovering on the edge of implosion. Charlie Kirk sat firm in his chair, posture straight, eyes forward, exuding the same unapologetic certainty that had fueled the clash. Whoopi Goldberg, however, no longer masked her frustration behind diplomacy. Her tone had shifted from sharp to surgical. "You don't get to sit here and play the victim," she said, her voice level but loaded. Not after minimizing the lived experience of millions just to make a point. A few audience members broke into scattered applause, but even they seemed unsure whether they were clapping for defiance or closure. Kirk didn't flinch. "The truth makes people uncomfortable," he said calmly. "I'm not going to apologize for saying what a lot of Americans are thinking." Whoopi stood up. The gesture was measured, but its meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't a pause, it was a decision. "Then maybe this show isn't the place for you to say it," she replied, still staring directly at him. One of the producers off stage stepped forward. A stagehand followed behind. The air snapped taut with anticipation. The line between theatrical tension and real confrontation had disappeared. And now, every eye in the studio, every camera, was watching to see who would move first. Kirk remained seated for a beat, then calmly stood. Not in protest, not in surrender, but in quiet defiance. "I guess we've said what needs to be said," he muttered, brushing invisible lint off his jacket. There was no handshake, no formal sign-off, just a stare down that lingered in the space between them like static before a storm. As he exited the stage, the studio remained silent. Whoopi returned to her chair, not looking back. No music played. No scripted banter followed. Just the raw echo of what had just unfolded. A segment turned spectacle, and a walk-off that blurred into something far more personal. The moment Kirk stepped off stage, the tension didn't break. It dispersed, seeping into every corner of the building. Crew members whispered behind clipboards. Co-hosts exchanged wide-eyed glances. A senior producer called for the legal team. The decision to end the segment early had been made on the fly, but it was already clear it hadn't come soon enough. By the time Kirk reached the green room, studio security had subtly repositioned themselves near every exit, not because of a threat, but because of optics. Everyone sensed the headlines were already writing themselves. Inside the control room, someone pulled up Twitter. The clip, 30 seconds of the final exchange, had already hit the platform, posted by an audience member whose phone hadn't been caught by security. It was spreading fast. The hashtags were brutal. The View meltdown, Whoopi vs. Kirk, walked or kicked. One executive muttered, "We've got about 20 minutes before this explodes beyond recovery." A staffer started drafting a statement. Another picked up the phone to warn ABC's PR team. There was no time to spin it, not yet. Right now, all they could do was contain the blast radius. In the hallway outside the stage, Whoopi stood still, flanked by two co-hosts. Her jaw was clenched. "I'm not doing that again," she said quietly. One of them asked if she wanted to cancel the remaining segments. She shook her head. "We finished the show," she said, "but this one, they'll remember." Backstage, Charlie Kirk was already on his phone, texting furiously, likely preparing his narrative. To him, this wasn't just fallout. It was fuel. And by the time the final credits rolled, the question wasn't whether the moment would go viral. It was how long the impact would last. Within minutes of the episode's abrupt turn, clips flooded every corner of social media. A grainy vertical video captured the exact moment Whoopi stood up. Another showed Charlie Kirk walking off, face unreadable. Hashtags began trending before the West Coast had even seen the broadcast. On Twitter, the split was immediate. Supporters of Kirk lauded his courage under fire, while others praised Whoopi for refusing to platform hate. Screenshots, memes, side-by-side edits, all of it cascaded through the timeline like a dam had burst. YouTube channels began uploading breakdowns before the show even ended. News outlets scrambled to update their headlines. Charlie Kirk escorted off set after a live clash with Whoopi Goldberg, one blared. The View melts down over politics, claimed another. The discourse had fractured into dozens of narratives, each one claiming to own the truth. Kirk's followers called it proof of liberal censorship. Critics called it a well-deserved reckoning. And for ABC, it was a full-blown media firestorm. PR teams raced to issue a statement that was neither an apology nor a defense, just enough ambiguity to slow the blowback. Meanwhile, audiences around the country weren't waiting for official versions. They were drawing conclusions, taking sides, and spreading content like wildfire. Celebrities began weighing in, politicians tweeted support or condemnation depending on their base. By the end of the night, the moment had transformed from a televised segment into a cultural flashpoint. Not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. The clip wasn't just viral, it had become symbolic. And no one involved, on stage or behind the scenes, would be left unchanged. By the next morning, the rest of the View's panel had scattered across the media landscape, each fielding calls, dodging questions, or quietly coordinating responses. But the silence couldn't hold. Sunny Hostin was the first to speak publicly, appearing on a morning news segment where she diplomatically stated, "Everyone deserves a voice, but that voice has to come with accountability." It wasn't a direct condemnation of Kirk nor a defense of the show, it was a line carefully threaded between solidarity and survival. Sarah Haynes, meanwhile, took to Instagram. Her post was short but pointed. Live television isn't supposed to be comfortable, but it should be respectful. Yesterday crossed a line. Ana Navarro remained off-camera but reportedly told friends the segment felt more like a setup than a conversation. The hosts weren't unified, not completely, but they were aligned enough to make clear that what had happened wasn't normal. Not even for a show known for tension and disagreement. Behind the scenes, production assistants swapped rumors about who had approved Kirk's appearance and what the producers knew beforehand. One crew member told a blog off the record, "We were told to expect passion, not disaster." The damage wasn't just reputational, it was relational. Trust between the hosts and the booking team had frayed. And while the cameras would roll again, the air in the studio would never feel quite the same. Everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop, especially since Charlie Kirk had yet to say a word. But that silence was about to end. Just before noon the following day, Charlie Kirk broke his silence. Not through a press release, not on mainstream media, but on his own turf. A live-streamed broadcast from his personal studio. The lower third read, "Censored on national TV," and his tone was anything but apologetic. "What happened yesterday was exactly why people are fed up with legacy media," he began. "They invite you on, pretend to want dialogue, then freak out the second you say something real." He didn't name Whoopi directly, not at first, but his message was unmistakable. He played select clips from the View episode, pausing at strategic moments to provide commentary. "Right there," he said, pointing to the freeze frame where Whoopi rose from her seat. "That's when they decided to shut it down. Not because I was disrespectful, but because I was effective." His followers in the chat flooded the stream with support. Kirk framed the entire ordeal as a setup, a staged ambush designed to trigger him into self-destruction. "They wanted me to lose my cool," he said, "but I stayed calm. They didn't." The video racked up hundreds of thousands of views within hours. Clips from his stream were reposted by pundits, political influencers, and media watchdogs. He called the moment a turning point, saying, "You don't win battles by staying quiet. You win by showing people what they're afraid to say out loud." The message was clear. He wasn't backing down. He was weaponizing the moment. And by nightfall, it was no longer just a headline. It was a movement, at least in the echo chambers, that had already decided which side of the story they believed. At ABC headquarters, the crisis meeting started before sunrise. Legal teams reviewed footage frame by frame. Network executives debated whether to issue a clarification, a defense, or a carefully vague apology. Public relations drafted multiple statements, none of which passed internal consensus. "We don't want to alienate the hosts," said one senior executive, "but we also can't give Kirk more fuel." The network was walking a tightrope, one where any misstep would deepen the fracture already exposed by millions of viewers. advertisers were watching too. Several top sponsors reached out privately requesting context before making decisions on future ad buys. One brand paused its campaign altogether, citing content sensitivities. Industry insiders speculated about long-term impact. Would this shake up the format of The View? Would producers face consequences? Would future guests come with stricter vetting or refuse invitations entirely? One producer reportedly told a colleague, "We've always courted controversy, but we just crossed into something else." Other talk shows began adjusting their bookings. Late-night hosts weighed whether to mention the clash, fearing they'd either reignite the fire or inherit it. Public trust in daytime television, already fractured along ideological lines, took another hit. What was once a space for spirited debate now seemed to many like a minefield, and while the cameras at The View would roll again, the episode had left a scar. One the network couldn't erase, no matter how they spun it. Inside The View's production offices, what had once been a routine post-show meeting turned into a reckoning. Whoopi Goldberg entered the room without a word, took her seat, and waited. Around her, the show's core producers, senior staff, and talent coordinators braced for what everyone knew was coming. She didn't shout. She didn't vent. She simply stated, "We need to decide what kind of show this is, because yesterday wasn't it." The room fell into silence. No one disagreed. Not after what had unfolded in front of millions. Some producers defended the booking, arguing that controversy drives conversation and ratings. Others pushed back, saying the guest vetting had failed, that red flags were ignored for the sake of drama. One junior staffer, visibly shaken, admitted, "We were warned this could go sideways. We gambled. Trust had eroded. Not just between the hosts and producers, but among the team itself. What had been a tightly run operation now felt like a house with cracked foundations. And everyone knew it." Meanwhile, ABC's upper brass began asking deeper questions. Could the format survive another moment like this? Was Whoopi still fully aligned with the show's future direction? Would Charlie Kirk's team leak behind-the-scenes emails or calls to stir further backlash? Nothing was certain. Except one thing. The line between engagement and implosion had been crossed. And whatever happened next wouldn't be confined to the studio walls. It would echo through contracts, negotiations, and reputations far beyond a single episode. By the end of the week, the broadcast industry had shifted its tone. Trade publications no longer referred to the Kirk-Goldberg clash as a dust-up or a segment gone wrong. It was now labeled for what it had become: a flashpoint. Think pieces circulated under headlines like "Daytime Television's Breaking Point" and "When Talk Shows Stop Talking." What once served as entertainment with a hint of provocation had transformed, before a live audience, into a televised standoff between ideology and identity. The fallout was still unfolding. Charlie Kirk continued to ride the wave of attention, positioning the moment as a victory for his message. Whoopi, meanwhile, returned to the table the next week with a calm but unmistakable steel in her voice. "We said what needed to be said," she told viewers, and sometimes that's what live TV demands. The audience applauded, louder than usual. Not because the storm had passed, but because everyone knew something irreversible had happened, and no one had backed down. So, what do you think? Was Charlie Kirk unfairly silenced? Or did Whoopi Goldberg do what any host should when a line gets crossed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell us what confrontation you'd like to see covered next. Because in the world of unscripted television, the next flashpoint is always closer than you think.